Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Danish TV's English language TV channel, the global voice of the Center for Islam and Decoloniality. And really, I say this all the time, and people may start to think I'm exaggerating, but certainly not today. We have someone with us who really, in my humble opinion, represents one of the most articulate voices, eloquent voices, but much more than that, committed, dedicated, impassioned voices for the global solidarity campaign to defend the Palestinians from the constant Zionist terror that's inflicted upon them. So it is with great pleasure to have Ali Abunimah, co-founder of the Electronic Intifada, with us today. Welcome, Ali.
Thank you, Junaid, and I've been a long-time admirer of your writings and your solidarity, so it's a great pleasure.
Thank you. From all of us here at the PSD in Pakistan, Palestine Solidarity Group, you don't know how excited we are to have you on our show. And of course, our primary viewership is Pakistani, but of course it's also a global viewership. But I think that the Pakistani, my students, colleagues, etc., are very excited to have you. So it's wonderful to have you. Ali, since we do have limited time, I did want to focus on two things. Of course, the title of the poster was on kind of the implications of this recent Israeli assault on the Palestinians, and we, just to give you some context, which I know you don't need at all, but here in Pakistan, why? I mean, we have not had any complaints about this, but why our TV show has been very persistent about doing these shows on Palestine, not just now during the latest kind of assault, but during also the previous, just a couple of months ago, when there was intense pressure put on Pakistan to quote unquote normalize with this abnormal terrorist state. And at that time, we really had to do show after show after show, and we got so many people. Unfortunately, at that time, we couldn't connect with you, but that was a very critical stage. We were very fortunate that we have a prime minister that really put his foot down on that, because I think you know as well as I do the type of kind of pressures these Gulf regimes and their largesse try to kind of bribe and put pressures and beyond that as well. I mean, really disgusting type of pressures of deporting Pakistani laborers and that type of thing. So that was a very scary moment for us, and it was also unfortunate that we did not have a lot of support, commentary. There was not a conversation taking place in the country, particularly amongst those who we would have thought would have been much better in placing this on the agenda, with the so-called liberal left and so on. So this is why we have been doing very consistent shows on this for a while. No complaints by anyone, but I just want to tell our viewership why this has been so important, and now it's culminated into something in which, in some ways, we feel redeemed in covering this issue because of the centrality of it, not only for itself, but in some ways as a symbol of the ongoing global coloniality. I mean, the way we speak about it, the colonial oppression of people like in Kashmir that we do a lot of programs about as well. So that's just a little bit of a background for you, Ali, why and for our viewership about why we continue to do these programs. But I wanted of course, your kind of post-mortem or analysis of what just happened and what it means, both for the Palestinians as well as for the Israelis. But before that, very quickly, for our viewership, that, of course, I mean, this was such a brazen and flagrant Israeli assault that was so visible on social media and people are taking on their video cameras and pictures and so on. It's difficult to hide, but again, an analysis of the kind of chronology of what happened, and then within the broader context of why you think that, yes, while this was disgustingly horrific and tragic, why it is actually, why, in your opinion, you may think that it's part and parcel of the Israeli settler colonial project.
Mm.
So there you go.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's all very important context. And in fact, I would like to start with the context and then focus on what we just witnessed in Gaza.
Yeah.
Less than a year ago, in August, Donald Trump was still president of the United States, and he triumphantly announced the so-called peace deals between Israel and various Gulf dictatorships, notably the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and of course Morocco a little while later. But of course, the elephant in the room, so to speak, was Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
which, although did not formally join these deals, is definitely fully on board with them. And you can say that informally already Saudi Arabia has made its peace with Israel. And as you mentioned, the pressure was on other countries as well. And there was sort of a game being played in the pro-Israel and Zionist media about who will be next.
Right.
Will it be Oman? Will it be Saudi Arabia? The Israelis were very confident. And of course, as you mentioned, the pressure was on Pakistan. And there was very much a notion that not only Arab dictatorships would join in the party, but non-Arab Muslim states could be induced to join because of notions that they were less attached to Palestine, that the question of Palestine was dead. And that was really what this was all based on. And you saw this propaganda coming from the Emirati media and the social media troll armies that the United Arab Emirates sponsors, insulting Palestinians and saying, you betrayed your own cause, you sold your land to the Jews, using this kind of anti-Semitic language as well. And why should we care about you when you don't even care about yourselves? So this celebration and party, this marriage between the Zionist settler colony and the Gulf dictatorships was celebrated over what they thought was the dead body of the Palestinian cause.
That's right.
So this gave Israel a green light to escalate its ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, and particularly in Jerusalem. And this is what brings us to the more immediate events, because with this blessing from the Arab dictatorships, from the United States, from the European Union, and so many others, Israel thought, well, we're on top of the world. Nobody can stop us. Nobody wants to. On the contrary, they're not only not stopping us, but United Arab Emirates investors, Abu Dhabi investors, are queuing up to come and spend their money in Israel. We saw disgusting deals where a member of the Abu Dhabi royal family even bought a share of Betar Jerusalem, an Israeli football team whose fans are most notorious for chanting "death to the Arabs" during football games. And let me call him a self-hating Arab. Invested tens of millions of dollars in this team. We saw representatives of the Israeli settlers in the West Bank going to Abu Dhabi and signing deals for the export of settler goods to the United Arab Emirates. So Israel got the clear message, we can do what we like.
Right.
So they escalated their ethnic cleansing in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, which has been targeted by fanatical religious Jewish settlers. They have escalated their ethnic cleansing in Silwan. And of course, a key target is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is crucial to understand, because I always reject the idea that Palestine should be seen as a religious conflict or a quote-unquote Muslim cause, because, of course, the solidarity of Muslims around the world for Palestine is much appreciated. But Palestine is not a a theocratic cause or a religious cause. It's an anti-colonial struggle. Nonetheless, the issue of Al-Aqsa is crucial to understand because it has been targeted by Jewish religious extremists called the Temple Movement, whose goal is the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and its replacement with the Jewish temple as part of their messianic end of the world scenario in which the Messiah will come.
Wow.
And these people...
Ali, let me interrupt you. Wow, the parallels to going back to 1992 in India.
Yes, I want to make exactly that parallel, right. Because to understand the parallel, you know, an audience in Pakistan, an audience in South Asia will already understand the parallel with Ayodhya, with 1992, with the destruction of the Babri Masjid. Yeah. And so, but let's take the destruction of the Babri Masjid without diminishing its significance at all, but multiply it by 1,000. This is what we're talking about in terms of the tinderbox, the fire that these religious fanatics are playing with in Israel. But what has happened in recent years is that these fanatics, this temple movement, moved from the fringes even of the Zionist establishment. You know, they were on the fringe even within Israel, right. 30 years ago, now to the center of Israeli society, where the temple movement is fully supported by the government, tacitly and openly, funded by the government. The settler organizations that are involved in the takeover of Palestinian homes around the old city of Jerusalem, and that are involved in the incursions in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, are supported by the government and supported by leaders of many Israeli political parties. So this you know, and you can again make the parallel to India, where the kind of the Hindu nationalism that was always there, the Hindu fascism that was always there, moved from the fringes to the heart of government. Yeah. And this is exactly what has happened in Israel. And so what happened over the last few weeks in early May was the escalation of the attacks on Jerusalem, with the Israeli self-confidence that we can do it, we can get away with it, nobody is going to stop us, on the contrary, they're going to reward us. Israel made a major miscalculation in thinking that the Palestinian resistance in Gaza would not respond. And in fact, there was major popular pressure on the resistance in Gaza, in Jerusalem, across Palestine, that you must respond to the attack on Jerusalem. And they did do that. And of course, we know that Israel, having been unable for many decades to defeat the Palestinian resistance militarily, takes out its frustration by punishing civilians, by massacring entire families in their homes. And we saw that demonstrated with great cruelty once again in Gaza, with Israel bombing apartment buildings, bombing homes, killing people in their homes. 14 families were wiped out. More than 200 Palestinians, the majority civilians. Almost 70 of them children were killed in this orgy of colonial violence, this spasm of colonial violence, which Israel meted out.
And their talking point is they are targeting Hamas, which is using...
Well, they achieved, of course, you know, the Israeli propaganda is always that we're targeting the so-called infrastructure of terror, we're targeting military targets. But when you actually read the Israeli press, that's where you find the truth. Because what they say is, actually, every single time we do this, the Palestinian resistance gets stronger and more capable and more able to evade the Israeli military defenses. So consider that Gaza, which is a tiny piece of territory, which has been under a brutal Israeli siege, helped by the pro-Israeli dictatorship in Egypt for 14 years, deprived of resources, cut off from the outside world. The resistance in Gaza was able to do much more than it did in 2014. In 2014, they were able to shut down Ben Gurion Airport for a couple of hours, or I think maybe a day. They were able to shut down Ben Gurion Airport for more than a week. It's essentially imposing on Israel the kind of siege that Israel has imposed on Gaza. Obviously, you know, you can't compare, but in essence, giving Israel a taste of its own medicine.
Right.
They were able to attack economic targets in Israel, the way Israel has for many years targeted and destroyed the economic infrastructure in Gaza.
Right.
They were able.
And Ali, what's so fascinating here is that this was not, you know, okay, the normal pretext used that the Israelis are responding to just rockets being lobbed by Hamas into Israel, and that Israel is just going after the Gaza Strip, and it's a conflict between the Israelis and the resistance in Gaza. What was interesting here is that it was, as you said, the demand for the resistance in Gaza to respond to what's going on in East Jerusalem.
Yes, and this was the historic moment here. Of course, Palestinians have always resisted since the very beginning of Zionism 140 years ago, and especially since the establishment of the Zionist colonial state in Palestine in 1948 through ethnic cleansing. Under the British, of course, people in Pakistan are very well aware of the British and their partition plots and the way that just, you know, uprooted millions of people. Of course, in Palestine, the British were on the side of the Zionists, and you know, that laid the ground for the Zionist ethnic cleansing in 1948, which Palestinians have always resisted. But the important thing to understand about the Israeli strategy for controlling the Palestinians is the strategy is based on fragmentation. It's classic colonial divide and rule. You have to separate the Palestinians into separate geographic areas where they can't communicate with each other. So Gaza is cut off from the West Bank. The West Bank is cut into different pieces from north to south and east to west. Then the Palestinians within Israel, you know, to provide an analogy, they would be, you know, a little bit like, I mean, they're the survivors of the Nakba, of the ethnic cleansing, those who remained behind in 1948 and were given citizenship in Israel, although they have inferior rights. They, you know, Israel has always used repression against them, a mixture of repression and co-optation.
Right.
So the ideal
survivors of the Nakba, basically those that the Israelis weren't able to ethnically cleanse in 1948.
Correct.
Exactly. Right.
Correct. So what you know, so Israel was always able to control the situation as long as Palestinians were divided. But what we saw over the last month was a unified uprising throughout historic Palestine, the military resistance from Gaza, resistance across the West Bank, and crucially, resistance of the Palestinians within Israel. And that is a strategic shift, and I think a threat that Israel would perceive as being really existential, because Palestinians living under Israeli control are actually the majority population.
Right.
They are over 50% of the population. When you take the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and the Palestinians in Israel, the Israeli Jewish regime is a minority regime. So what you have is a situation that could, you know, if this kind of resistance is sustained, you have a situation of potentially of ungovernability, like apartheid South Africa in its final years. So you hear among Palestinians a great sense, of course, of outrage and horror at the destruction that and the wanton murder that Israel perpetrated in Gaza, once again deliberately targeting civilians. Of course, the irony is Israel claims that Hamas and the other resistance groups target Israeli civilians. In fact, the Palestinian resistance groups, although they have improved their missile technologies, don't have sophisticated guidance systems. They can't really target specifically this building or that building.
Right.
And yet they do attempt to target Israeli strategic locations like oil pipelines, which they managed to hit this time, and military bases and so on.
And
but Israel,
and this is, of course, Ali, the sick irony that Israel, on the one hand, that has given billions of dollars in aid in military weaponry to supposedly have very specific kind of guided missiles and so on,
manages to kill,
kind of exactly destroy entire infrastructure, civilians, and so on,
and to kill mostly civilians.
And
so
where does Hamas get anything? Nothing. It gets nothing of that sort.
Nothing of that sort. Although they have they publicly thanked Iran as really the only country that we know of that is standing by the military resistance, and you know, people can love Iran or hate Iran, but that is an acknowledgement that Palestinians have a right to resist, as any occupied people does, and they have a right to receive assistance for their military resistance. So that really provides us, I think, with the big picture of where we are, that the Palestinian cause is contrary to the beliefs and wishes of the enemies of the Palestinian people, including the Gulf dictatorships, that the Palestinian cause is absolutely not dead. It remains central. It is really, perhaps along with Kashmir, the last anti-colonial struggle of the period of decolonization that began in the 1940s, and it is unfinished business. And this Zionist colonial apartheid regime must fall, and there cannot be peace, there cannot be justice, there cannot be anything resembling coexistence until this colonial apartheid regime falls.
No, that's very well put, and I think that Ali, you hit the nail on the head of how things from the Trump-Kushner notion and their collection of all of these tin pot Arab dictators and their whole agenda for then beyond the Arab world, as you were saying, and of course Pakistan would have been a great prize for them, which is why they were so focused on Pakistan. But I think you hit the nail on the head. How things have shifted from a sense in which all of these players believe that that Palestine is a dead issue now. We don't have to even deal with it. We have our Abraham Accords that we can celebrate, and that we can just expand our normalization with Israel and so on, and we don't even have to care. And now how things have shifted in terms of the global outpouring of solidarity with the Palestinians, all of that stuff, the talk of mobilization, none of this, I mean, people won't dare, even the ones, some of the ones here that were more tempted to be bribed by the government, they won't dare to utter these words anymore. So it tells you how things have shifted dramatically after what's happened. And this brings me to just a very brief last question, which you have certainly mentioned in your points earlier, but the miscalculation that the Israelis made, what has it now led to in terms of what you see as the grand consequences that we see now, and that we could perhaps, if you look into your crystal ball, what we can see where the movement is going, both within the Palestinian struggle there on the ground, but also global solidarity, and particularly, say, in the United States, and in the West in general?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing to say is just to state perhaps the obvious, but it needs to be stated. The Palestinian people will never be defeated, cannot be defeated. In other words, Israel's dream that there will be a time when Palestinians simply give up and submit to Israeli rule because Israel has bludgeoned them enough, murdered enough of their children, destroyed enough of their homes. This time will never come. That day will never come. And so so it doesn't matter. You know, we saw from apartheid South Africa, the South African regime was never defeated militarily. It always had the tanks and the warplanes and the guns and the forces to kill as many Africans as it wanted to. But that could not provide its security. Nuclear weapons could not provide the South African apartheid regime with security and ensure its existence. And Israel is in the same boat. And this is something we have to recognize, that the will of the Palestinian people, its determination to be free, to be liberated, and to live on its own land in freedom is something that no tanks, no warplanes, no F-35 missiles from Israel, from the United States, no Iron Dome can defeat that. Because once a colonized people, and we've seen this, I hope the Palestinians will not have to make these sacrifices. And myself living outside Palestine, I never tell people in Palestine, you must do this, or you must go out and fight, or you must go out and sacrifice yourself. I would never do that. But what I think, what I do is I respect the decision of the people there. And they have taken a decision to resist. And we have seen that when colonized peoples, whether it's in Algeria or Vietnam or in South Africa or so many other places, when they take a decision to liberate themselves from a colonizer, no matter how cruel that colonizer is, no matter how powerful that colonizer is, that decision is irrevocable. And they will not simply fold up their hands and say, we give up. That won't happen. So now, in terms of solidarity, I think we have seen with each of these Israeli massacres a shift in discourse. But let's just talk about the West now for a few minutes. And it's taken another leap now with this Israeli massacre in Gaza. Israel has lost the narrative. There was a poll taken of US voters during the Israeli attack. I was astonished by the results. It was a Morning Consult poll. I wrote about it at the Electronic Intifada. Just 28% of Americans, less than a third, said they sympathized more with Israel than with the Palestinians during the attack. When you looked at Democratic voters, it was just 12%. And more sympathized with the Palestinians than with Israel. And when you looked at Republicans, of course, there was much more support for Israel, but it was the barest majority of 51%. This is a shift I didn't expect to see happening so quickly. And you can see the panic among Israel's propagandists that all the old propaganda tricks are no longer working, and there is now a broad and deep understanding spreading across the world. Of course, it was already in countries across the South, especially in Pakistan and many others, but it is now spreading to the West that the Palestinians are a colonized people, are an oppressed people, that Israel is the oppressor, and that the Palestinian cause is just, and that the Palestinians have a right to struggle for their liberation.
No, very well put, Ali. I think, and just a funny comment at the end. You see it's a manifestation of the way the desperate propaganda tactics that the Israelis are now having to use. Is that you wrote your own article on the Electronic Intifada? I encourage people to see it, in which the former Israeli Defense Minister Bennett
and apparently the next Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett,
apparently the next Prime Minister falsifies the image of a hospital that they bombed, calls it the Al Shifa, and he puts the picture of the Shifa Hospital in Islamabad, Pakistan, on it. So this is the level to which they are now stooping. It's always been there, and it's going to have to increase because, as you say very well put it, the kind of the Zionist narrative, its propaganda value has lost so much credibility now after what's happened now and previous invasions, but especially what's happened now. Now, Ali, I'm very sorry. I would love to have you forever on this show, and this has been an incredible privilege for us. I thank you so much for coming on the show, Ali.
My pleasure, and let's continue the discussion another day. There's much to talk about.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. That was Ali Abunimah. Thank you for joining our show. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.